Hi, seventh graders. We're going to focus today on the Battle of the Alamo to the Mexican-American War. This is going to be a lot of information and kind of a big overview of a big war, the Mexican-American War, and I'm just going to jump right in. But first I'll tell you what your assignment is. You can either watch this whole video in order to fill out the guided notes, the fill-in-the-blank notes, or you can attend the Google Meet where I am going to do this video live. So I'll run through the slideshow and you can get the notes filled out with me at the Google Meet. But if you can't attend the Google Meet, then continue watching this video. But your assignment is these notes. You'll get the information in the video in a few minutes. If you are going to continue on with the video, I want to tell you it takes a minute to get to this. I'm going to give you some background information before we begin. Either way, you need to fill in the guided notes using the slideshow that's going to happen here or at the Google Meet. All right, so we're talking mostly about the Mexican-American War today, and just a quick overview. This is a 20-month war that lasts from April 25th to 1846 to February 2nd, 1848. So it's about a year and a half long, in the middle of the 1800s. 13,200 Americans died in the war, 25,000 Mexicans died. The United States dominates in this war, but it is a heavy casualty rate for both sides. James Polk is the president at the time for the United States. This war is preceded in the 1840s by Texas declaring its independence from Mexico in 1836. Overall, between Texas leaving Mexico and the United States claiming the land of California, Nevada, Arizona in the war, Mexico will lose just about half of its total land. And I'm going to show you a brief video before we get into the guided notes. That takes you just kind of through an introduction of this whole war.
The American West conjures images of adventure, lawlessness, and opportunity. But what possessed us to go west in the first place? It all traces back to an important but not very well-known conflict in the mid-19th century called the Mexican-American War. In the 1840s, America was a pretty young country, and it was hungry to expand. President James K. Polk was especially eager to acquire more territory. He believed in manifest destiny. That's the idea the United States had a duty to expand westward across the North American continent. There was a lot of incentive for American settlers to go west. They could spread religion, strike it rich in business, or just get a fresh start. Needless to say, America's neighbor, Mexico, wasn't thrilled about the westward expansion craze. Both countries were already on thin ice. Mexico was bitter about losing Texas to the U.S. after it won its independence in 1836. President Polk wanted California and New Mexico, too, and he offered Mexico $30 million to purchase them. But they refused to sell. But hang on, conquering the West was America's manifest destiny, right? So Polk wouldn't take no for an answer. He picked a fight, sending troops to occupy a disputed area of the Texas and Mexico border. And when American troops and the Mexican cavalry clashed, Polk seized the opportunity to declare war on Mexico on May 13th, 1846. Ultimately, Mexico was unprepared for war. Its internal politics were just a mess, and its cavalry couldn't measure up against the expertise of the U.S. military. After 2 years of fighting, Mexico was defeated, and in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, it ceded a third of its territory to the U.S., areas that include modern-day Utah, California, Nevada, Arizona, and Texas. The Mexican-American War had a major impact because it resulted in one of the largest territorial expansions of the United States. It also launched the careers of a few generals you may have heard of, future U.S. President Zachary Taylor and Civil War titans Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant.
Okay, last thing before we start the notes is I want to tell you about Mexico's president during both the Texas Revolution in 1836 and the Mexican-American War in the 1840s. Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna is one of my favorite historical figures. He is leader of Mexico 11 times. So he has a 22-year reign between 1833 and 1855. He declares himself the Napoleon of the West. I studied Mexican history in college. That's part of my degree. And he is one of the most over-the-top characters, influential people that most Americans haven't heard of. He's the guy leading the charge against the Texans at the Battle of the Alamo. He shows up a lot in this history, and I'm going to tell you one particular story about him that'll help you remember Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, and that's the story of his leg. So the story goes like this. 2 years after the Battle of the Alamo, which we'll talk about in Texas, in 1836, Santa Anna actually gets in a battle with the French when the French invade Mexico in 1836. Santa Anna gets severely wounded by a French cannon in his leg. So he's a president, he's also the general of their army. He gets wounded in the legs, and doctors are forced to amputate his leg, which Santa Anna then buries. He buries his legs back at his home, his estate in Veracruz. Once he becomes president again, in 1842, as a show of pageantry, I'm not sure why, but 6 years later, he actually exhumes and digs up his shriveled leg and creates a whole parade for it and sends it on a parade through Mexico City to a very ornate church where he buries it beneath a cemetery monument in an elaborate state funeral that included cannons, poetry, lofty speeches all about his shriveled 6-year-old amputated leg. A few years after that, his public opinion of him turned in Mexico. People got frustrated for other reasons with Santa Anna. They actually dug up his leg from the church, and people paraded it around the city yelling, "Death to the cripple." Now, if that's not weird enough, in 1847, during the Mexican-American War, Santa Anna, again, leading his own military as both president and head general, is surprised by an infantry unit from Illinois, and he flees from a battle with the Americans. And he flees, but he forgets to bring his prosthetic leg, this. And so the Americans actually captured Santa Anna's prosthetic leg during the Mexican-American War. They brought it back on tour in the United States, and to this day, it's in a military museum near Chicago in Illinois. So don't forget Santa Anna. He's going to come up a lot. He's quite the character. If we had more time, I'd tell you more stories, but I think you had enough for now. We're going to jump into the notes. All right, so this is what we're talking about today. The reason we're talking about this is because right about the time that the Oregon Territory, including Washington, becomes part of the United States, up until the 1840s, both Britain and the United States claimed this territory. But about the same time the United States cements this territory, it also cements both Texas and all these states we gained from Mexico in the Mexican-American War. This is a brief story about these two places, Mexico, secession, and the Texas annexation, because it ties together the United States at the same time we do the Oregon Territory. Let's jump in. So get your notes ready. Mexico wins its independence from Spain in 1821. So Mexico's a newer nation than the United States. And immediately Americans began settling in Mexico's northern border, now Texas, but they retain U.S. customs. Stephen Austin, there's an Austin, Texas named after him. He's from Virginia, and he's granted the right to start a colony in Mexico. He brings about 300 families to Mexican Texas in 1825. So Americans start settling in large amounts in Texas, which is Mexican. Well, as you can imagine, the colony's success brings more settlers from the U.S., and over about a 10-year period, soon Americans outnumber Mexicans in Texas 6-1. So for every 6 Americans, there's 1 Mexican in Texas, which is part of Mexico. And eventually, the Mexican government's actions begin to upset American settlers. It's about taxes. Mexico didn't have the same religious freedoms, and the Americans get frustrated and want their independence from Mexico in Texas. This all leads to a revolt in Texas. And in 1829, Mexico closes Texas to American immigration. There's another picture of Santa Ana. They declare that Texans must start paying taxes to Mexico. Kind of makes sense. It's actually not an unreasonable request. But again, Texans are American settlers in Mexico, in what is now Texas. So many American settlers in Texas begin wishing to break away from Mexico. And President Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna sends troops to Texas to end the revolt. And this is Sam Houston. So he's the leader of the American forces fighting Santa Anna in Texas. So Texans clash with Santa Anna's army. Sam Houston and other Texan leaders declare Texas independent in 1836 by signing the Texas Declaration of Independence. Now, there's a battle that is super famous, which is the Battle of the Alamo. We're going to focus more on that tomorrow. But the short version is, at one point, the Texans retreat to an old mission, a church, in the March of 1836. And for 12 or 13 days, 150 Texans hold off an army of 6,000 Mexicans, led by Santa Anna himself. Eventually, basically everyone in the Alamo is killed by Santa Anna. With a few exceptions, there are a few women and children that are able to escape. Remember the Alamo becomes a famous battle cry. This is the battle that kills Davy Crockett and other famous U.S. frontiersmen. And then I want to talk about the Battle of San Jacinto. This is the decisive battle in the Texas Revolution. Sam Houston leads the Texan army in April 1836. And basically what happens is Santa Anna is captured. So part of the problem is you don't want your president to also be your lead general, because when they get captured, or if they get captured, Santa Anna, in order to save himself, is forced to sign a treaty giving up all of Texas and giving Texas its independence. And Texas is a huge amount of land, but that's how he's able to return back to Mexico, which angers a lot of Mexicans, of course. All right, so Texas is technically its own country for about 10 years, from 1836 to 1845. And many in Texas who are former American settlers want to be part of the U.S., and they're officially brought in after 9 years of being their own country. They're brought in 1845. Texas is by the United States. However, Mexico is still angry about this Texas Revolution and considers Texas to be part of its territory, and tensions build and war is certain. So we'll jump into the second part of this, the Mexican-American War. It's pretty one-sided, although lots of Americans do die in this war. 13,000 die in this war. But U.S. forces are able to capture New Mexico, California, and northwest Mexico. The war lasts about 20 months. And the victory, so the United States doesn't lose any major battles, and we're not going to get too much into this war, but the victory corresponds with this idea of manifest destiny. And manifest destiny is an American belief. It is a strong belief of our president at the times, James K. Polk, and it's a belief that the United States has a divine right to spread west and to spread its beliefs of democracy and capitalism to the western part of what is now the United States, Mexico, Washington, etc. But it's this belief, manifest destiny, that we are supposed to expand west. All right, so the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ends the Mexican-American War. And you can see the land here that Mexico loses. Mexico loses all of California, all of Nevada, all of Utah, all of Arizona, all of New Mexico, and then, of course, Texas. This is about half of Mexico's land. So Mexico agreed to accept the Rio Grande River as the north border of Texas. Mexico recognizes that Texas is part of the U.S., and Mexico gives up a large stretch of land between Texas and the Pacific Ocean. Here's a battle map of different battles. And that brings us to this. This is what is now the modern map of the United States with this area seceded. We will later purchase this little area, Gadsden purchase, from Mexico. And of course, we purchased Florida. We didn't talk much about that. But this gives us the modern map of the United States. The Mexican-American War coincides with the Oregon Territory, including Washington State, becoming part of the United States. And by the 1840s, 1850, the map of the United States is set. All right, guys, I think that's enough. Again, if you have completed this and you got your notes, you're done. You don't need to come to the meet. But if you didn't get this far, come to the meet. I hope you guys are doing well. Thank you, as always, 7th graders, for watching. Have a great rest of your day.